Hi, and welcome to Strategic Fantasy Football, a player's guide to dominating your fantasy football league. I'm Tom Neiman, this is my partner Tom Glanzer, and the information you're about to receive was developed through years of research and experience, taking the best strategies and techniques and incorporating them into this easy-to-follow system that is simple to apply to almost any fantasy football league. Over the next few minutes, we'll take you through the steps necessary to draft, acquire, and trade your way into a championship fantasy football team. We'll also explain how to use the breakpoint drafting system, as well as the draft mapper and trading cheat sheet. Now, some of you are probably familiar with our breakpoint drafting system, but for those of you new to this system, we'll explain it in more detail a little later in the show. We'll also give you some ideas to help enhance your league by making it more fun, more challenging, and more exciting.
Before we look at your team, let's first look at your league. You have to have your league set up the right way in order for you to get the most out of it. The most important thing to know is know your rules. Rules come in many forms: scoring, adds, drops, positions, and deadlines, just to name a few. If you don't know them, you'll be at a distinct disadvantage to those in your league that do know them.
Scoring is huge. If your league has a base scoring system, such as touchdowns count 6 points, field goals 3, and defensive special teams scoring is touchdowns only, then change your system. Start today to get your commissioner to add a little spice. The more complicated the system, the better. You can try several different scoring systems, such as 1 point for every 10 yards of rushing and receiving, or 25 yards of passing. You can also have bonuses at 100 yards rushing and receiving, and 300 or 400 yards passing. Now, defense is an area that's also fun and easy to enhance. Depending on how many points your defense gives up can be a huge factor in fantasy football. Safeties, fumbles, interceptions, and sacks are all stats that are recorded and can be incorporated into any fantasy league. Knowledge is power, and the more complex the scoring system will mean a few guys in the league will miss something, and this only helps you. So start getting support from others in your league to make the scoring system more complex.
The next area of concern is add and drops. Every league, every year has some dispute over an add and a drop. Adding players after the draft is very important. Most leagues have rules with regards to the ins and outs of adding. Who can add a certain player? Is it first come, first serve? What if two guys want the same player? What to do if you tie on a bid? Whatever your league uses for rules, all we say is know those rules and know them well. Stress to the commissioner that you expect these rules to be followed and enforced. Again, if you understand the rules and know that you will not break them, then no one else can get an unfair advantage, because the rules were too vague. Make sure the rules are specific. Make sure they are stressed. Also monitor what happens in your league.
Deadlines are very important. Trade deadlines, add-drop deadlines, when your lineup is due, and when you can switch your lineup. These are all very important, and all leagues have these deadlines. All we can say is know when they are and let your commissioner know that these deadlines have to be followed. Now, every league has a guy that fails to meet the deadline, but the commissioner just seems to let it slide, and that guy always seems to win when he should have been penalized somehow. Now, it's frustrating, we know that, and not really fair to those players that take the time to learn the deadlines. Now, although having specific deadlines is important, the most important thing is to make sure that your commissioner stresses those deadlines and follows them closely. Have distinct rules in place to be applied when deadlines are not followed.
The final word on rules is know your definition. Is Cordell Stewart a wide receiver or a quarterback? Is Jimmy Kleinsasser a tight end or a fullback? Some leagues only require a publication in some form to state what position may or may not be used. If that's the case, look for opportunities and then attempt to find a unique positional change that may be prepared and then use them on draft night. For this reason, we have included some very liberal interpretations of our breakpoint drafting player list. Review these lists and be prepared to present them at the draft if there's any question. Also, make sure your league institutes a rule such as a publication rule that we just discussed.
Let's look at perhaps the most important night of the season, draft night. Now, mind you, we don't believe you can consistently win on a good draft alone, but its importance cannot be overstated.
As Tom said, draft night is the most important night of the season, and such preparation is a must. Preparation starts in August and leads right up to draft night. We recommend a healthy dose of SportsCenter and every possible football show you can get your eyes on. The internet is an excellent way to get information, but pay attention to those that are only updated materials. Some articles are written in April and May and then are so inaccurate by draft night that they become worthless or even harmful. we suggest you use upperhandsports.com as your source for draft information and information throughout the season. On the night of the draft, we recommend you bring your breakpoint drafting system, the draft mapper, a highlighter, a pen, and a scratch pad. Use your highlighter to mark off the players as they are picked and jot down notes and ideas as they come to you. It's so easy to think of a certain player in the late rounds or a certain draft strategy and then forget about it a few picks later. There's nothing more frustrating than seeing the sleeper be picked after you thought about that player and then forget about him.
Here's a few tips to make your draft night more successful. Now remember, draft night is supposed to be fun, and if your league is the type that likes to enjoy a few adult beverages, that's just fine. But remember, you got to stay in control. A couple extra drinks might cloud your judgment, and that can be costly down the road. Also listen for comments made by others at the draft. Be as discreet as possible and try picking up little side information, especially amongst partners. It's crucial. A good idea is to bring a friend that really knows fantasy football, but for whatever reason might be in some other league. Now, the one thing that we have learned over the years is that partners always draft better than individuals, but that's kind of where the advantage ends. Draft night forces a decision, and usually two heads are better than one, so bring a friend along and have them help you in the decisions.
Now on to Draft Mapper. Draft Mapper was developed to give you insight into the minds and player needs of your opponents as the draft develops. Did you ever wish you knew which players were going to get picked in the next few picks? Well, we did, and we made the Draft Mapper to do just that, or at least give you a logical way to guess the position that will be picked next. Here's how it works. After the draft order has been decided, fill out the owners' names and draft orders. Include yours. Highlight your name so your spot in the draft sticks out. As the draft plays out, simply mark off the position that has just been picked. As the rounds go by, you should be able to see which player may get picked in the round and which position may not get picked simply because the next few guys picking have already filled that spot. With any luck at all, you should be able to determine when to pick a player and when you can let a good player go by, because you can rest assured that that player will be there when it's your turn to pick again. In this example, we have shown a very realistic draft development where 11 through 14 have had their fourth pick, but teams 1 through 10, including you, still need their fourth player. As you can see, you have an excellent chance to pick a good wide receiver or running back with your fourth round pick, and wait until the fifth round because 7 of the 9 teams have already picked their quarterback. At worst, you will get the third best quarterback, and that's only if Ron and Doug choose to pick a quarterback. Chances are there's at least 5 to 10 running backs or wide receivers that would have been taken with the 4th and 5th pick for teams 1 through 10. But instead, you got to choose the player you want and need, and will still be able to get the quarterback of your choosing. Although not guaranteed, it will help you decide which position the upcoming owner will need and which ones they don't need. This may help you decide to let a player pass and get him on the next round, thus allowing you to draft a more sought-after player and a player that fits your needs.
Right, now on to the breakpoint drafting system.
Drafting is very important, but it's not as nearly as complicated as some of the magazine and football shows make it out to be. The breakpoint draft system breaks player lists into mini-lists based on their ability to shine in fantasy football. All players fall into one of 4 categories, which are simply termed Tier 1, 2, 3, 4. The object is to pick an even team and pick players that are the highest tier available for the position that you need the most at that time. The key is to realize that a winning team must be balanced and productive. This means that you must recognize that all positions are not created equal and that there are only a few superstars. And every position has several players that are basically the same. A good example would be the fact that the 5th best quarterback, for instance, is probably worth a lot less than the 5th best running back. The trick is to get players from the highest tier available for the position you need. Chances are you won't be able to get 2 players from the same position in Tier 1. So you would be best served to move to a different position and a higher tier to try and stock up on 2 highly rated quarterbacks. As players are drafted and taken out of the play, you'll want to pay attention to the groups of players in a given tier. If you're unable to draft a Tier 1 quarterback, the best thing you can do is fall back and go after Tier 1 players in other positions. If you can plan on picking 2 or 3 quarterbacks from a Tier 2 and then waiting to see which guy excels. The theory is that all players in a given tier are basically the same, so why waste an early round pick when the number 7 guy is basically the same as the number 12 or 13 guy? Let the other owners waste their picks and get that number 7 guy while you pick a higher tiered player in another position. As the rounds go by, the system remains the same. However, the tiers just get bigger and the difference between player abilities are even less noticeable.
Now that you know how to use the draft mapper and you understand breakpoint drafting, let's go into the positions. Now again, obviously scoring is crucial. With over 30 teams in the NFL, there are probably 40 to 50 good wide receivers, 15 good quarterbacks, and 15 to 20 or so good running backs. Place kickers are basically all the same. Some are a little more consistent than others, but every year there are a couple of exceptional ones, and nobody really knows who they're going to be until about week 10. Other than a couple exceptional tight ends, the rest are basically all the same. Remember, there are usually 5 to 7 good defenses and 5 to 7 bad defenses, and the rest of them fall into the middle. First, let's discuss quarterbacks. The common myth is that quarterbacks are the most important player on your fantasy football team. Now, we disagree with that. There's only a few good quarterbacks worth taking in the very early rounds of the draft. Do not look at a winner in real football as a sure thing in fantasy football. Troy Aikman, for instance, won some Super Bowls, but he's not a good fantasy football quarterback. Never take a rookie quarterback unless your league allows rookie holdovers, and then only take one late in the draft, in fact, very late. Stats are the only thing that count.
If you draft a quarterback that you just know will be your starter, the only safe thing to do is to draft his backup. But only if he's a proven commodity, such as a seasoned veteran who's ending his career, or a former starter who's simply being replaced by the next up-and-coming superstar quarterback. The reason you draft this player, and make sure you do it late in the draft, is because this particular player cannot get injured until he plays. That reduces the chance of your being without a quarterback the week after your starter goes down. While we're on the subject of backup quarterbacks, make a note of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks taken in the draft, and then try to steal the backup quarterbacks to those quarterbacks in the middle rounds. The guy who drafted Kurt Warner always thinks Trent Green is going to be there in round 15, and he is frustrated when somebody drafts him in the 7th round. He may never play a single down for you during the season, but if that top guy gets hurt, he becomes the instant player of value, and you stole him in the middle or late rounds. He could become an instant high point scorer for you and your team, or at the very least, could become trade bait for the entire season.
Most fantasy football leagues have 10 to 14 teams, and if your league is similar, you need to pay special attention to the following. If you failed to get a Tier 1 quarterback, then it's time to fall back and wait a couple of rounds, and at that point you can draft 2 or even 3 quarterbacks that are ranked in the 2nd or 3rd tier, and you can count on one of them to emerge during the season. After a few weeks, you will have your starter, and more than likely he will not perform that much less than a Tier 1 quarterback taken in the draft. Now, immediately after you draft a quarterback, begin to carefully discuss your high expectations for him in the upcoming year. Other fantasy players will listen, but none of them will remember if you turn out to be wrong in your predictions. If you happen to be right, though, you get instant credibility. Now, with quarterbacks, stats are amplified either good or bad. If you happen to draft an average quarterback and that player lights it up in the first couple of weeks of the season, you look like a genius and you get instant credibility with your talent assessment. Now, the same thing holds true with running backs, but their impact takes a couple more weeks before you can say, "I told you so." Now, remember, no one's going to remember that you were wrong as long as you don't overdo it, but it's easy to remind somebody that you were right if your player performs.
In our opinion, the most important talent-based and not system-based position on a fantasy football team is the running back. In recent years, the only team that seems to be producing quality running backs based on the system is the Denver Broncos. For almost every other team, if their starting back goes down, they're in big trouble. For this reason, coupled with the fact that running backs get hurt so much, we suggest that you take as many backs as possible. If you're only able to play 2 running backs per week, we suggest you draft at least 4. Second-year guys that have successful rookie seasons usually really excel and are worthy of a high pick. Always draft big names even if they're at the end of their career. Big names with average stats trade better than no-name players with good stats. The key if you wish to build your team around trading is to trade players when they're hot if they have big names, and to trade no-name players when they're producing average numbers but you expect more. Always draft regional favorites, both pro and college if possible, and if they have value. If you know a guy in your league that loves Notre Dame, always draft guys like Tim Brown or Jerome Bettis. If you live in Wisconsin, try to draft a Packer or 2. The final word on running backs is durability. Durability is a must. If you have an injury-prone running back as one of your starters, such as Terrell Davis, it's always good to draft his backup. The key with drafting a backup running back is very, very late in the draft. Usually nobody would trade for a backup running back like they would for a backup quarterback, but they could still carry some value to you as the owner.
Now, like quarterbacks, there are only a few great wide receivers, and the big name is important. Know the offensive coordinators that have switched to new teams and adjust your draft accordingly. Rookie or young quarterbacks make good receivers into average receivers. See Keyshawn Johnson, for instance, in 2000. Now, since wide receiver is such a wild card position, you must get production from that slot. Be prepared to make moves early to get producers at wide receiver. If you pick up some no-name players who happen to have a couple good weeks at the beginning of the season, trade these guys quickly. Now, you will make some mistakes over the years, but just accept that and move on. Now, normally, wide receivers that have a couple of good weeks but are not well known are quickly shut down after the defensive backs in the NFL learn these guys' moves. Also avoid but don't totally ignore the good receiver that just switched teams. For some reason, though, when a team either trades a great receiver or picks him up as a free agent, he just never seems to recapture the stardom that he once had. Look at Carl Pickens after he moved from Cincinnati to Tennessee, for instance. If a team has a superstar wide receiver, it's always good to draft the number 2 guy on that team. Darnay Scott had some of his best years when Carl Pickens was most productive in Cincinnati. Now, most fantasy football owners ignore a team once a superstar has been picked, and this is a real opportunity for you in your draft.
If your league happens to allow touchdowns for kick returns, then it is advisable to look towards the receivers that actually return punts or kicks. Although this is an additional danger to them getting long-term injuries, the potential to pick up extra touchdowns or 2 during the season cannot be overlooked. There are only 1, 2, or 3 tight ends worth taking in the first few rounds. The rest are hit and miss. If you happen to get the top 2 or 3 tight ends, you can probably ignore that position for the rest of the draft. If you don't get a top-tier player, then draft 2 or 3 of the second-tier players, and be prepared to drop those guys within the first few weeks. Decide early which tight end you want to keep and move on. Trading tight ends is very difficult. For this reason, the best and only real opportunity you'll have to trade a tight end is early on in the season, unless he's a Tony Gonzalez type tight end. If you're lucky enough to draft a second or third tier tight end and he happens to excel within the first 2 weeks, dump him quick. Every now and then you will trade away the next Tony Gonzalez, but be prepared to live with that mistake. If nothing else, it shows the rest of the league that you are at good risk to trade with. Point out the fact that you traded away a star and make light of it.
Now to kickers. What can we say about kickers other than that they're all basically the same? Every year, 1 or 2 guys will separate from the rest of the group, but the next year these guys could be cut in week 1, who knows? For this reason, draft 1 or 2 kickers and decide early on which one you're going to keep and then drop the other one. Don't bother to trade him, it's just wasted time and wasted energy. Now, do not worry about bye weeks with your kicker unless the league absolutely requires that the position has to be filled. The 5 to 10 points that you might miss out on in the bye week do not offset the value of having an extra running back on your roster. Drafting a kicker may be more a function of drafting the team that he's on more than the actual player himself. Always draft a kicker who kicks indoors if you can, especially towards the end of the season. Outdoor kickers, of course, in December do not fare very well in the points department, and now is the time to make note of that.
The final piece of the drafting puzzle is defenses. Defensive drafting is perhaps the most difficult and misunderstood position for any owner to draft. There's only one key to drafting a good defense, and that is the strength of schedule. Your Breakpoint drafting cheat sheet has a strength of schedule list on it, and we suggest you follow that list as your main guide.
There's always a few great defenses, a few bad defenses, but the fact is that most of them fall into that huge middle category. So go without a defense on your bye week if your league allows it. And remember that many stats on defense center more around the opponent they played last year than anything else. For this reason, pick the teams that will be playing against weak teams most of the year, and forget about stats like turnovers and defensive touchdowns.
Defensive touchdowns are almost always a lucky break or bounce and therefore cannot be counted on in any way, shape, or form. Going back to what we talked about earlier, if your league doesn't have a very extensive defensive scoring system, we suggest you push the commissioner to add that. Add a point for sacks, interceptions, fumbles, recoveries, and safeties, and how many points are given up by the defense. This will make your league more exciting and play right into your hands as far as knowledge of positions.
As we wrap up the topic of drafting, we would like to hit on a few extra points. These are somewhat manipulative maneuvers to do on draft night, but again, the value cannot be overlooked. While the draft is going on and you have plenty of time to wait for your next pick, ask some distracting questions. How much is Mike Anderson going to play again this year? Will Antonio Freeman have another down year, or will he finally come back and have some decent stats this year? Why did this running back or that running back have such a good preseason or such a bad preseason? How's Ricky Williams' ankle going to be? How is Eddie George's knee? You get the picture. You're not actually looking for answers to these questions. Instead, you want to get people talking about these players, get distracted, and influence each other. The less time they spend analyzing a player's talent, the better, and you can be instrumental in getting that done.
Also, notice what certain people draft and then draft to trade with those players in particular. If Matt drafts the top quarterback in the league with his very first pick, then draft his backup in the middle rounds. If somebody has your backup quarterback, draft theirs. Also, if you happen to know that Rod Smith is Tim's favorite player in the world, draft him. He may just be a little more valuable to Tim than he's really worth to you.
Well, we'd now like to move on to my personal favorite aspect of any fantasy football league, and that is the art of trading. Successful trading is more of a skill and an art than it is just plain luck, and it's a lot easier than most people think. It takes a little bit of time and patience, but it's well worth it. Fantasy football is a game of wits and knowledge. It measures the skill and the craftiness of an owner to create the best team he can. Now, anybody can get lucky with a good draft based on 5 or 6 good or lucky 1-minute decisions on draft night, but it takes a real skill to build a team over time with many moves, acquisitions, and package deals. Be prepared to hear people say, "I don't care enough to make trades," or "I don't have enough time to make trades." The translation is, "I wish I had a clue how you were able to pull these trades off, but I just don't get it." Trust us, every one of those guys would love to trade. They just don't know how.
The first rule of successful trading is to know your opponent. Know your opponent's favorite team, his favorite college team, or his favorite player. Make mental notes of a player that hurt a particular owner last year or helped him to win. He's willing to trade a little bit more to get that guy, and he may want to dump a guy a little bit easier. Let's face it, you really do want a player from your favorite team, and so does he. You can use that fact in several ways, either by promoting a player beyond his true value or by being resistant to give up one of his favorites that you happen to own and that he really wants to get to.
Rule number 2 in trading, superstars are rare. Keep them at all costs and always be willing to trade 2 or 3 hole fillers to get that one superstar. There's only one possible way to do this, and that is when another owner has a need or a perceived need, so look for it. Injuries or bad stats are an opportunity. You know that Edgerrin James is not going to average 14 carries for 61 yards the whole season long, but if his owner is frustrated with the last few games, you can move a couple of average guys with good stats to get James on your roster. You now have James, and the other guy may fill 2 holes at the expense of 1 superstar, which may be just what he needed. The best trade is one that helps you both.
Always point out the fact that the player you traded away did a good job. It's easy to detect which superstars are vulnerable to trade just by listening to their owners. Such phrases as, "Sure, he's a great running back, but I have no one else," or "He'll be back in 3 weeks, but I'll be out of it by then." Those are sure signs that that particular player can be picked off of someone else's roster later. Statements like that show that this particular owner realizes he has a superstar, but is frustrated by the fact that he has no supporting cast. For this reason, it's a great opportunity to come with a couple of average players and snatch up that superstar. In many cases, the 2 or 3 average players you are trading to this owner will actually benefit him by giving him more points and a more diverse lineup, while at the same time, you are able to snatch up the superstar you want.
One thing is for sure, trades only happen if you present an option to the owner and show him that he will benefit. Many of the guys I've played fantasy football with for years always wish they could make a trade, but there's one simple fact: they never call anyone. You must present an option in order to make a trade. Again, never trade a superstar though, unless you absolutely have gigantic holes that you need to fill and there's no other way to do it. Wide receivers are plentiful, and so are quarterbacks, but running backs are solid gold. The running back spot is the only hole you absolutely must have, so it's the only spot you should be willing to trade a superstar in order to fill. Other than to fill a running back spot, you should resist trading a superstar at all costs, no matter how good the deal sounds.
Rule number 3, know your stats. Know who's consistent. Know who's on the rise and who has started to decline. Some guys have slow starts but traditionally finish strong. Some guys are the exact opposite. Know it and trade accordingly. Every NFL player that gets playing time may have some value in fantasy football. Your job? Find it, exploit it, and then gain from it. Unless your league is a holdover league or the guy is a phenom like Randy Moss, you should look to trade the high-performing rookie in week 5 to 10. By that time, he's had enough time to show he's for real, but hasn't worn down yet. Remember, pros play 4 to 5 preseason games and 16 regular season games against other pros. Last year, rookies ended with maybe 10 games in college against lesser competition. Many owners are frustrated when their high-flying rookie running back gets replaced in Week 13 and he can't figure out why he traded to get this guy. While the consistent veteran player he has traded away still averages 80 yards a game and a half a touchdown a week.
A part of knowing your stats is knowing the schedule. You need to recognize why one of your players is doing great or doing horrible. Trade an average running back with great stats if his great stats came against a weak team. Also, a great running back can struggle against great defenses. That's the time to go get him. Trade for the guy that has a favorable season-ending schedule. That's playoff time in most leagues, and that's when you want to win the most. This is the reason the trade guru in your league always gets lucky with his trades. The trade that others will call stupid is the same trade that pans out in 2 or 3 weeks. The funny thing is, he always knew it would.
Rule number 4, what to say and what not to say, and then when to say it. This is obviously the most important thing in making the trade. We've all probably experienced a time when a person that doesn't know how to trade has approached us. In retrospect, the offer may have been one we should have accepted, but for whatever reason, probably presentation, we did not accept that offer. Knowing what to say and how to say it is really the meat of any trade.
You must always explain why this trade is going to help the other guy. Always admit that the trade is going to help you, that's obvious, so just come out and say it. Also point out that you can both gain from this trade, and that's a good thing. The other player shouldn't really care if you're going to gain from this trade. The point is that the trade will help him while the other players in the league stay just where they are. Never overemphasize the talent that you are offering in the trade. It just makes no sense to do it. Why would you trade a superstar player if he's really as good as you say he is? Instead, explain that your guys are good, but you clearly want the great player that you are trying to go get. Along with not overstating talent, never totally degrade any of your own players unless they really stink, and then you can do it openly. It gives you credibility, and it reinforces your positive statements about the other players that you want. One other note, if another owner is ripping a good player that is just having a bad couple of weeks, be prepared to use that to your advantage. Remind him of what he just said about that player and that you are willing to take that guy off his hands. And take a chance that the guy will come back and have some good stats. It's just a statement that the other owner finds difficult to back away from, and it's the foot in the door that you may need to get the trade done.
When dealing with partners, only deal with the decision maker. Stress the fact that you choose him because he is the decision maker. I have found that the uninvolved partner always seems to axe the deal that the active partner had just made 9 times out of 10. I'm not sure why that is, but the partner always makes trading difficult. After a partnership turns you down, and they will, explain that you want one decision maker and then deal with that partner. A little internal strife is helpful, and you can usually make a better deal the next time around. Showing a little frustration at the other guy and explaining that that is why you like to play it solo will probably help grease the skids a little bit. Little phrases like, I like to make my own decisions and I don't really like to rely on others are nice phrases to use to influence an active partner to drive a small, almost undetectable wedge between the two.
When someone says, let me think it over, or I'll get back to you, it's usually the kiss of death to any trade. If the deal is not done immediately, it usually doesn't get done. Come up with a deadline that makes it imperative that a decision be made as soon as possible. Trade deadlines, add-drop deadlines, another trade is pending. These are all good deadlines to present to the other owner. Never say that you have to have a decision now, though. It scares them off every time. It's a fine line to walk, but you must force a decision based on some external, out-of-your-control problem. You don't want to force them, but you have no choice. If you must choose, though, between letting them think it over or decide now, let them go. It's better than the sure no that you'll be getting.
Always be willing to trade 2, 3, or 4 players for the one you want. Assuming that you had one superstar from the draft, it would be huge if you were to get another number 1 pick from the draft early in the season. You can then work on getting another number 1 before long you have a dominant core. You may ask, how and where do I keep getting the players to trade? 2 methods. throwback players of value, such as backup quarterbacks or injured players, and acquisitions, i.e. adds and drops. If your league bids on pickup players, try hard to get the players you need. Don't try to save a buck or two and miss out on a quality player. Running backs are a premium. And even if you have 2 great running backs on your team, always keep looking for the opportunity to get a third. It's no fun to leave points on the bench, but the luxury of having that extra trade bait or injury backup is just too much to ignore. Running backs can always be traded for a position that you need in a crunch. When you make a trade for a superstar, there's usually a few throwback players involved to make the trade even from a roster number standpoint. This is where you get players to be used in future trades. Always have the other owners throw in running backs or good backup quarterbacks to fill the roster. If you get lucky, you may be able to use those players in a few weeks if they happen to have good games. There's no greater trade than the one that allows you to get a superstar and then snag some other good players using rejects from another owner's roster.
Now that you know how to restock your trade bait through throwback players and acquisitions, be prepared to move some players and move lots of players. Never regret trading away a guy that turns out to be a high performer. In fact, be happy unless you directly get beat out by that player. Be happy because that owner is going to let everybody else know where he got his guy. And that's going to make it much easier to trade to him and to the other owners in the future.
Be prepared to negotiate. Offer a little less than you're willing to give and ask for a little more than you're willing to take. I stress a little on both the ask part and the offer part, as this makes it very difficult for the other guys to say no strongly. Once he is firmly denied, it's tough to come back and reestablish trade talks, so avoid a no at all costs. It trains your opponent to expect to negotiate. This gets him in the mindset of exploring options, discussing trades, and thinking that he needs to do something.
Now remind him that no one in your league has ever won the league based on his draft alone, which is probably true. Convince him that the guys that fail to trade never seem to win the whole thing. They might win a couple of weeks here and there, and they might string together a decent record, but they just never seem to win the whole thing.
If you detect a willingness to trade, but just not the players you are offering, then get some type of commitment for what they would be willing to trade for. Make them give you a list. For instance, I'll trade you Warner for 2 of these 6 running backs and the middle-of-the-road quarterbacks such as so-and-so and so-and-so. Get this list and a commitment that he will actually do this if you somehow miraculously are able to hold on to these players. Usually the owner will look at it as such a remote possibility that he will agree to it because he will see stars in his eyes and he'll get a couple of really good players and fill in the quarterback spot. This is when you are now in control. Reassure him that you are going to try to get this and remind him of how difficult it will be. So if you're actually able to get these players, he's made a commitment that he will have to live with. He will almost certainly agree, and then you can end your conversation.
Now, once you have a list of scenarios that another owner is willing to accept, you can start looking towards the most rewarding but difficult method of trading, and that is the multiple owner trade. The key to multiple owner trades is to never fully explain the entire trade until it is complete. Even then, don't reveal all of the details except to the commissioner, and even then explain as follows. Just simply tell him that there's been a big trade, and to save time on the details, I'll just tell you who got who, and the commissioner can then make whatever changes are necessary. This way you don't have to explain the fact that you traded guys you really didn't have, because it really doesn't matter. Everybody involved in the trade was willing to give up certain players to get certain players, and you were included in that mix. Now, this is a way to move players from one team to another without having the task of actually having to obtain each player onto your roster before moving him on again. And again, it really doesn't matter that you are trading and dealing with players that you did not own. The thing to remind yourself and to the others is what they were offering to give up in exchange for what they were willing to accept is an acceptable trade. And if so, you can have 4, 5, or 6 owners involved with you driving the whole trade.
What we want to do now is take you through a multiple owner trade and how one comes to pass. Since we don't know how this season will work out, let's take you back to the 2000 season as an example. The names have changed over the years, but the theory and the strategy behind these types of trades remains constant.
Let's say, for instance, you realize that you need a star running back and you have a few decent, just not really great players that you would like to move. Now, the player you want is Stephen Davis, and Trent has him. Now, since Trent has Stephen Davis, you must first look at what Trent needs. You notice that he has two decent receivers, but they're from the same team. Say he has Muhammad and Donald Hayes, both from Carolina. They've both been performing well through the season, and you notice that he can never seem to decide which of those wide receivers to play. He also was unfortunate enough to pick the Minnesota Vikings defense. It's the only defense he has. Now, Davis is his starter, but he also has Mike Alstott, who's been sitting on the bench for him. Alstott's had a couple of good games, and you notice that Trent is giving up points on his bench with his running backs at the expense of his defense and the indecision of his wide receiver position. Now, this is where the fun begins. The first thing you do is look for your excess. Say you have Dante Culpepper, and you're very happy with him. He's durable, you know that he is going to play the rest of the year, and his bye week is already behind him. Now, you drafted Jeff George in hopes that something was going to shake loose in Washington, and it has. Brad Johnson has been struggling, and you notice that Joe drafted Brad Johnson early in the draft. Joe is frustrated. He sees that George might be the starter. Joe has a similar problem now as Trent, just with a different position. He has the Ravens and Tampa Bay's defense. Both of them are good, but he always seems to pick the wrong one. Now, you make him an offer that seems too good to resist. You offer to give him Jeff George and Trunge Candidate because he has Marshall Faulk as his primary running back. He likes having Candidate because he's Faulk's backup, and now that he has Jeff George, he will always have the starter for a high-flying offense. All you ask for is the Ravens and maybe some backup running back, say Skip Hicks perhaps. You downplay the fact that you want Hicks, but really getting Skip Hicks is just a small but important part of your trade. Once you have gotten Joe to commit to this, it's now time to move on and look for what you can do with the Ravens defense. Now remember, Joe's happy because he's going to play Tampa Bay the rest of the year anyway. You now approach Trent and suggest the fact that you want Davis, but you realize he's going to need quite a bit to give him up. You remind him that he has Alstott as his third running back, and he can easily move Alstott in to replace Davis. He won't play quite as good as Davis, but considering what Trent's about to get, he can certainly live with that drop-off in production. You remind him of the terrible game the Vikings have had the last 3 weeks and offer him the Ravens defense. You tell him you don't have the Ravens defense, but if you could get it, would he be interested in something along those lines? He's seeing the minus points that the Vikings have been giving him in the last few weeks, and his eyes start to light up. You also notice that Trent has Eric Bjornsson as his starter at tight end. Bjornsson has done nothing in the last 5 weeks, so you throw him an offer that he can't refuse. You suggest the fact that you might be able to get him a top-notch tight end to replace his tight end. You also know that Trent is a huge Packer fan. You can't understand why, of course, but he just is, so you offer up Schrader, the wide receiver for the Pack. You remind him that he has both Muhammad and Hayes, and he always chooses the wrong one. You would take either one of these guys, but you would prefer Muhammad because he has more value in the trade market. Now at that point, recap the give and get, while at the same time you are writing all this down on your sheet. You suggest to him that you would like to get Stephen Davis and Muhammad. You will be willing to take the Vikings off his hands, and in replacement for all of those, you would suggest that Alstott become his starter, the Ravens defense replace the Vikings, which is a huge help, and that he would have Schrader, who is of course a Packer, replacing Muhammad. This takes the decision-making power out of his hands in regards to Muhammad and Hayes and gives him one of his favorite players. You also remind him that you would like to get him a top-notch tight end, and you throw out a couple of names. You don't actually say Shannon Sharpe yet, but you throw out a few names. He will probably give you a verbal commitment to this, and then you have one piece of the puzzle left. Now you need to look for that top-notch tight end, and somehow you have to get that Packer away from Larry. You were lucky enough because Larry is also a Packer fan, and he was unfortunate enough to pick Freeman and Schrader. He loves Freeman, and he's going to keep him, and he hasn't been playing Schrader anyway. Now, Larry's been playing Dietrich Ward as his third starting wide receiver. You remind him that Ward really hasn't done much other than the first couple of weeks, and this has to be getting frustrating. Larry also has two really good tight ends, Shannon Sharpe and Jay Riemersma. He always starts Sharpe, but Riemersma seems to do just about as good every week. The problem is Riemersma hasn't had a bye week yet. This is where your roster comes back into play. You notice that you have Andrew Glover as your tight end. He provides no real value to you as you have 2 tight ends and your other one is average as well. You would like to get a better tight end, but it really doesn't matter. Your other guy will fill the bill, so you are willing to throw Glover in on any trade. Now, Larry needs a tight end, and he's the type of guy who doesn't want to go with an empty roster spot for any reason, and therefore taking Andrew Glover on his roster to fill that spot is a blessing for him. Now, the final deal that you bounce off of Larry is that you give him Muhammad, if at all possible, and Andrew Glover, if you're able to secure him in exchange for Sharp, and remind him that Remersma is now his starter, so there's not much of a loss there, and Schrader is a guy he's not playing anyway because he has Freeman. Muhammad is a former Pro Bowler, and he will be replacing Dietrich Ward, who just simply has not done anything in the last few weeks. Now, your whole trade tracker form is complete, and you can make one final quick call to all the parties involved in the trade. You go back to Trent, tell him the tight end you got was even better than you expected. You now have Shannon Sharp, and you are willing to give him the Ravens defense, Shannon Sharp, and Schrader, because he's a big Packer fan, and his big key is that all he has to give up is Stephen Davis. It's not going to hurt too bad because Allstott is not going to be his starter, and Hayes will be his easy decision as the Carolina wide receiver to play. He also gets to dump the Vikings defense, which has been costing him points, and he gets to replace them with the #1 defense in the league. The trade is now complete, and the rest of the league will be wondering how in the heck you got Stephen Davis and his backup Skip Hicks for a backup quarterback, an average tight end, and a running back that hasn't played much, while the other 3 people involved all got something that they needed and wanted, and it was a fair trade. You may think this type of trading activity is impossible, but the truth is it's not. If you draw it out and take a little bit of time and don't ever step over your bounds, you can pull off trades like this every time. It starts with you deciding what you want and what you're willing to give up to get it. Then it's just a matter of finding the people that can fill the slots needed. You may extend it to 3, 4, or even 5 other owners. The best trade is the 3-owner trade because everybody gets something and nobody knows everything of what just happened.
That's a lot to keep track of just to make one trade, but it's all necessary if you want to get the top-notch players you're after. The key is to look for excess in rosters at a certain position in particular. Every league has about half the teams with an excess at one position or another.
Now, as Tom said, excess is the key. To pull this trade off, you must identify the excess in your roster as well as excess in the other players' rosters. You then simply point out the fact that the other player has that excess and that it is costing him every week because of the points that he is leaving on the bench every week. You offer a solution which includes taking that excess off his hands and replacing it with players that could score points for him in the slot that he is currently lacking in production. Now, the key to remember is that trades like this are not only possible, but they will fall together like this as long as you keep your plan to yourself and keep your eyes open for opportunities. If you happen to make 1 or 2 of these trades in a season, you will be the odds-on favorite to win your fantasy football league.
Well, we hope that this video and our instruction will help you have a successful fantasy football league. We are fantasy football fanatics, and we've tried many different rules in the several leagues that we have participated in. And at this time, we'd like to pass along some ideas to make your league a little more fun. These ideas are not necessary to help you win or lose, but they will make your league more entertaining and encourage more participants in the future.
One idea is the carryover player. All leagues have different rules on carrying over players over to the next year. Some allow none, while others allow 2 or 3. We would suggest 1 carryover player in exchange for your first-round draft. An owner does not have to carry over a player, but if they choose to do so, that would replace the first-round draft pick.
Rookie carryover players. As an incentive to draft rookie players, some leagues will allow you to carry over a rookie in exchange for your 5th-round pick the next year. This will create an incentive to pick a couple of rookies in hopes that one of them will emerge as a superstar worthy of a pick greater than a 5th-rounder next year.
Salary caps are used by assigning a certain value to each player and restricting an owner to only spend a certain amount of dollars per year. Salary cap leagues take a little more bookkeeping and a little more accounting, but they are extremely fun and they take a lot of planning and coordination of players. The one restriction is that it does not allow for extensive trading, and you will be restricted to the amount of talent you will have on your team.
Internet leagues. We would strongly suggest that your league get on the internet. There are several sites that now offer free internet service that calculate everything from standings to weekly scorings. Most of them have updated scoring by the minute, and you can watch your games develop.
Playoff leagues. In many leagues, the playoffs are over by week 17 of the regular season. Now, this is unfortunate because fantasy football should be at least played all the way to the Super Bowl. The way you can accomplish this is that you disregard all rosters and have a new draft. Obviously, with only 12 teams in the actual playoffs, the number of players are limited. Therefore, playoff leagues allow different owners to have the same player on their roster. The only exception is that not every single owner can have the same one quarterback. That would prove fruitless and unproductive.
Playoff party. Our league has always had a playoff party at the end of the season. We do this between week 17 and the NFL playoffs. This allows us to draft our playoff teams and also spend the transaction money. If your league is like ours, there's transaction fees for trades, ads, and drops. We use half of the money for our playoff season and half the money for our playoff party.
How about a trophy? For some reason, the trophy adds a great incentive to winning. Might cost $15, but it's amazing what a group of guys will do to try and win that silly trophy that's going to end up in the closet anyway. It also makes for a good show to bring it to the draft. Our league has had a traveling trophy where we add the name of the winner each year, and that definitely becomes a great source of pride within our league. Again, we would like to thank you for your time and hope our ideas help you in your fantasy football league. If you'd like additional information as the season plays out, we invite you to join us at upperhandsports.com.
Good luck. Hope to see you next season.